Well, thank you all for coming. Welcome to the University of Washington, Tacoma, and welcome to the University Writing Program's 4th Annual Symposium on Writing. Tonight is this year's second of 2 guest speakers this year. Our theme this year has been the role of mindfulness and embodiment in writing and assessment. And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and also for viewing it online. Thank you all for those couple of you who were able to come to the morning faculty workshop. It went really well. I really enjoyed it. Dr. Barry Kroll will speak more on that topic in a few minutes. But let me introduce just a little bit about him so you can know something about him. Dr. Barry Kroll is professor of English at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. His research and scholarship resides in the field of composition and rhetoric, and has considered, among other things, argumentation and intense or serious disagreements. Dr. Kroll's work has explored ways to participate in those arguments without using the adversarial strategies that tend to perpetuate conflict rather than resolve it. In his book, The Open Hand, Arguing as an Art of Peace, he considers alternative approaches to arguing, describing a course that draws on principles of dispute resolution as well as insights from the martial arts and practices of mindful awareness. Dr. Kroll teaches courses on style, nonfiction writing, and speculative fiction. He has also authored Teaching Hearts and Minds, College Students Reflect on the Vietnam War in Literature, as well as been an editor for several other collections of essays. When I first read The Open Hand, it was a paradigm-shifting moment for me in teaching. The idea of using bodily movements and philosophy from Aikido to teach argumentation was revolutionary to me, and helped me as a writing teacher and scholar think more carefully about the ways that teaching and writing and its learning in classrooms are embodied experiences. We don't just read or write with our minds, but through our bodies. As teachers and students, I think we should pay more attention to this. So I'm sure he'll offer us something exciting tonight and provocative. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Dr. Barry Kroll.
Very much, Sal. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for that very generous introduction. So I was telling Sal before that I lived in the Tacoma area for about 8 months. I was in the military. It was 1968-69, and I was stationed at Fort Lewis. So that was a long time ago. It feels like a very different life. I've been thinking a lot about that since I've been here, just because I've sort of been brought back to a lot of names that I haven't seen in years, like Puyallup, I think, or something. I haven't seen that word in a long time, but it's really been great to be back. And I come back to Eastern Washington, come back nearly every summer since probably about 1980 or something, because my very best friend from graduate school taught for a long time at Whitman College, is now retired, but still lives in Walla Walla. And he and I are avid trout fishermen, and we love fishing in the West. And so I come back virtually every summer and go to beautiful streams in Oregon, Washington, and Montana to fish with him. So I live a long way from the state, but in some ways I feel very connected to it because of these ties and visits I've been able to make. So it's great to be here. So I'm going to be talking to you about a course that I've been teaching. This course is actually a seminar for first-year students at Lehigh. All first-year students have to take a seminar on something. Mine is a writing intensive seminar. I really teach it like a writing and rhetoric class, although technically it doesn't count for their writing requirement. I often think, though I don't say it too loudly, that they do more writing and learn more about rhetoric in my class than they do the class that's called writing. But anyway, I wanted to be straightforward about that. There are a couple things that are sort of different about my class. They're highlighted up here. One of them, of course, is that I'm interested in mindfulness, and I'm interested in martial movement and how they play into learning to do this thing I call arguing differently, arguing in a different way. This is a different course in many ways, partly because they're doing mindfulness and martial arts, but there's some other unusual aspects of the class that I'll try to get into a bit. But why am I teaching this different kind of class? Let me talk a bit about the goals of this class. I really think the heart of what I'm trying to do is to expand students' perspectives on arguing. I want them to think about arguing in a more capacious and varied way, to broaden their repertoire of strategies. And the whole point of this is that they have options. They have options and choices when disagreements arise. There's one other aspect of this class that's a little different than some classes that I want to point out, because it'll make sense of some of the things I'm doing later. I really teach it as a composition and communication class. Composition and communication. And because of that, I try to range across a large number of conflict situations, ranging from sort of everyday disputes that students have. Is this working still? It looks like it's cutting in and out a little bit. And from everyday disputes to the kind of formal, argumentative disagreements that people have in college papers. So the class really ranges across a variety of composition and communication contexts. And I think what I like to try to do is see continuities across this range rather than pointing to differences. Of course, an everyday dispute with your roommate or an argument with your mom over money is not quite the same as writing a formal, footnoted academic argument. But I think there's some amazing parallels between those two, and that when we draw on those parallels, we allow students really to deepen their engagement with rhetoric. I always start my class in a different way as well, but with a couple of activities. One of the things that I do in every class is to start with this little moment of mindfulness. I think many teachers who have become attracted to the mindfulness curriculum and the mindfulness pedagogy idea, try to integrate a little bit of mindfulness into every class so that students just become accustomed to finding their center, reflecting, taking a moment to just get in touch with where they are and who they are and what's happening inside. The way I do this is I have a little mindfulness bell. Not that we need a bell, but I just think it makes this a nice symbolic exercise. And so I'll say to them when they come in, let's take a minute and settle and take a couple of breaths. It's focusing on breathing in and breathing out and watching what thoughts are in my mind, what's arising, can I let that go? Maybe I just thought we'd try it for 30 seconds, just do a real brief one. So if you can kind of settle yourself, get ready to take a breath and focus on the breathing in and out, calming your mind, and paying attention to your thoughts. Ready? Well, that probably wasn't even 30 seconds, but I got nervous when I stopped here. So this little activity of just quickly calling attention to this act of mindfulness is important, I think. And later on in my talk, I'm going to try to pinpoint why it is that I think this brief moment of mindfulness is really quite significant. This isn't just a cool way to start class. I think it has a functional relationship to some mental attitudes that are going to support arguing and support arguing differently. So that's one thing I do right at the beginning of class. We do some other activities as well. Sometimes we'll do, instead of doing the moment of mindfulness, sitting quietly and breathing, we'll do a little exercise where we'll move our hands. In the workshop this morning, I talked about an exercise I really love called waving hands at clouds. It's a Tai Chi movement. I'll just show it to you real quickly. We don't have time to learn it very well. It starts out, if you want to follow along, you can. You put your right hand out. Just do it the seating. Put your right hand out to the right. Scoop down right by your belly or your chest. Come up and turn your body and look at your hand. Watch your hand move back to the other side and extend it again. Now put the other hand up beneath the first one. Top hand palm down, bottom palm up. Now as you scoop, This hand's going to go back in front of your face. Follow it with your whole body. Let your whole body rotate. Hands come together and pass. And you come back to the right. Now this exercise can be coordinated with breathing, so it becomes a breath-centered exercise. It's very good for sort of relaxing the mind and bringing you into a different space. So these activities have a functional relationship to argument, but they also provide a kind of transition moment for me as the students move into the classroom. They're moving from a world outside, a busy world of worries and exams and projects and relationships and confrontations, and suddenly they're in my class. I want that to be a different space. I want there to be a transition into a space of mindfulness, attention, attentiveness, and a focus on this whole project of arguing differently that we're going to wrestle with for the semester. I'll just tell you about one other exercise I really stumbled on that I love to do. And I do it the very first day of class. The first day of class, I give them an article to read. I actually send it to them on email, so they're supposed to read it before they get there, right? Now, these are brand new college students. I teach this to students who have just gotten off the bus, as they say, right? And there they are in college. First time, it's Monday morning, they're in my class, and I ask them to read an article called Doorways. And what this article says, it's by a mindfulness teacher, that doorways are objects that we pass through many times during the course of a day and never pay attention to. Never notice that we're actually going through a doorway. But it's important to notice doorways because doorways aren't just architectural features. They're symbolic structures. They're portals. There's passageways from one place to another. When we move through a doorway, we're moving from one state to another state. And we ought to notice that. Well, they read this and we talk a little bit about it, and I say, think for a minute about the doorways that you're going through. Take a look at that door you just walked through into my class. Did any of you notice that door? They go nervously, no, not really. What's the big deal, you know? And so we talk a little bit, but then I say, what other doorways have you just been through? And then the light bulb goes, well, we just came to college. I say, yeah, came to college. That was a doorway. You just went through one of the biggest doorways. That and getting married and graduating, these are doorways in human life. And so often we go through those doorways and we get to the other side and we think, I say, you're not going to believe me because you're first-year college students. But 4 years from now, you're going to wake up and you're going to say, is it over? What happened? Where was I? Did I even see the trees turn color in the fall? What did I miss? So the key to this is we need to be aware of transitions, aware of moving from one space to another, what the portal is from one kind of activity or mindset into another. And this classroom is a special space. This doorway is a special portal. It goes from mindlessness to mindfulness. It goes from a mode of interacting out there to one that's going to be different in here. And then I'm hoping that what you're going to do is take what's in here and take it back through that portal. Take mindfulness out of here. Take the martial movements out of here and back into your everyday lives. And that's why for me the rhetorical principles are not just about writing narrowly construed, but about rhetoric construed very large, about how we interact with others when we encounter oppositional disagreements. I got on a roll there, and I sort of lost my place on my slides. Well, let me just go quickly to say that I do get students commenting on these short meditation periods that we do at the beginning of class. A lot of times they're very honest, and they say, it's not easy to do this, and it's not. I mean, if you've never tried to sit there and sort of take a look at what's in your head and sort of still the thoughts or quiet them or let them go, you have no idea what's going on in your head. It's just playing on autopilot. They do things like waving hands on clouds, and they think it's a little bizarre at first, but then it kind of catches on and shows them it's different. Now, the last activity we do at the beginning of every class, and this is another one of these transition points, is what I call clapping in. Now, clapping in comes from martial arts dojos Most dojos do this. At the beginning, there's a formal ceremony of bowing in and then a clapping. And it goes like this. They clap twice softly and once more loudly. And so I key this in every class. We do our little activity, and I say, let's begin. And I hold my hands up, and they all in unison go, let's do it right now. Okay, just that. So let's begin. I love this activity. I mean, it has so much richness to me. For one thing, it's a movement activity. Hands are moving. Bodies aren't, but hands are moving, making noise. There's a kind of mindfulness bell, calling our attention to the present. We're here now. We're ready to go. You've come through the portal. You've cleared your head, and now we're ready for the activity of the day. And then the final thing on most class periods, I do an activity that I call a jump start. Now, jump start is an activity that a student actually leads, and I ask them to do this. I ask them for every class where there's a reading assignment, and I have a lot of short readings about arguing techniques and conflict resolution. I ask a student to take a big idea, an interesting idea, an idea that's worth sinking your teeth into, and ask them to represent something about that idea in one slide, one picture, a picture that they can find on the internet. So they all love the internet. They go out and troll the internet. And they find a slide with an image, and it can have a few words. And the task is not to get up and lecture about it and play teacher. Usually the first couple somebody does that. Say, no, that's not a great idea. You're not me, you're not lecturing on this thing. But to get up and say, what do you think about this? What in the reading got you excited about this? I thought this was a really exciting connection. What did you make of it? And then the student is inviting the class to get started. And that kind of jumpstarts a discussion. When it goes well, there's a sort of buzz. It gets going. I jump in. Next thing you know, the class is taking off. And it's taking off talking about the readings, but it's something the student wanted to prioritize, and the other students got involved in talking about. Now, I'll confess that every once in a while it doesn't go very well, and I have to say, well, that was very nice, but let's move on to this. But when it goes well, it's really, really great activity. And I like it a lot. So I'm going to show you one of these. This is one that a student did in one of the first classes this semester. So he came in, he showed this slide, and he said, so what do you guys think? What'd you make of this? Well, if I asked you, what would you say? What is this? You didn't do the reading, but it doesn't matter. Anybody got an observation about it? I know I'm putting you on a spot. Yes. You look like you wanted to say something. A sword fight. Good. That's great. It's a sword fight. It's a sword fight. That's important. What else?
It's funny.
There's a bit of humor. What?
Mortal Kombat, but there's that yes but argumentation that it's always yes but.
Exactly. That's so. I mean, just doesn't that ring so true? You know, this is right. Yes, but. So that it's linking physical confrontation, and especially a kind of deadly sort of sword fight, with a verbal element. That is, an interaction where someone is agreeing or seeming to agree, but agree only momentarily to strike back. Okay? So this was a fantastic, I mean, I didn't find it, my students did. And I thought, wow, this is so great. I'm going to use this in my presentation as my jump start. This is my jump start into this thing. Because what I'm interested in is a type of argument that's very much represented in this slide. And it's what I call oppositional disagreement. I'm interested in arguments that are rooted in oppositional disagreements between people. Now, there are a lot of other kinds of arguments, and not all arguments are fights. And it's much broader than that. I realize that. And I'm interested in those other types too. But I'm really kind of fascinated by this idea of oppositional argument and some of the features of that I want to start working with. So the goal, the big picture that I have then, is to work with oppositional disagreements and arguments, but try to help students see that there's some alternatives to the pattern that's depicted in this slide, this yes but. I use swords, just as in that slide, which is another reason it's so appropriate. I use swords to illustrate this point. Swords that are in conflict with one another. And this is the kind of sword I use in class. I've actually been just doing this for a very short period of time. I'm just playing with this thing. And I think it's working, but I'm figuring it out still. So this is a rubber version of a Japanese sword. And I want to use the sword because I think it really dramatically illustrates a certain kind of relationship between arguers that I think is very fundamental and lies at the heart of what I'm trying to introduce as a new way to argue. Okay? There's a kind of typical way, which is just like what was going on there. Okay? There's a confrontational approach to argument. I'll show you another slide with that one, maybe. Okay. So one pattern of argument I talk about, I call the sword of contention. Sword of contention has some features. It's head-to-head, confrontational. It has a linear configuration. That is, this guy, and you saw that in the other slide too, that for every strike like that, somebody's beating at each other, going kind of in a line back and forth, trying to score points, trying to defeat the other party. So it has that sort of linearity, and linearity is an important feature I'm going to talk more about in a minute. It's very adversarial and contentious too. I mean, swords are contentious instruments. So in this pattern of the sword of contention, I think we have a kind of model of the way what most people think about arguing, at least contentious arguing. The whole model of it is constructed around a fight, whether it's a gunfight at the OK Corral, or a fist fight, or a sword fight. Confrontation and linearity, I think, are key components of it. So what I want to do is, well, let me just show you quickly here that my students really love doing this. I have them act out even this linear model, and they think there's a lot of fun in class. But I'm doing it for reasons more than fun. I hope I'll get to that soon. What I really want to do, though, is broaden this idea of swords being in contention, directly hitting one another. And I do this in two steps. One is to talk about what I call the sword of redirection. I'm going to be talking a lot about this in a few minutes, but the central idea here is that the swords now are orthogonal to one another, rather than being linear and pointed at one another. And then I want to talk about a third model, which is, I call it the sword of transformation. In this model, the swords are parallel to one another, both pointing in the same direction. So we have three geometric models of conflict: linear, orthogonal, and parallel. Here's another way of representing these three. In what I call contention, there's a linear struggle between these arrows or forces, whether they're swords, arrows, or fists. There's a back and forth push, pull, give in a little, push back harder. In redirection, there's a realignment one of the parties takes to moving to the side, and the forward movement then pushes in a different direction against the other person. It realigns the forces, and I call this redirection. And the final one, there's a further realignment where they're standing parallel, and I call this transformation. Now, which model of arguing do you think students are familiar with? Well, that's a stupid rhetorical question because the answer is obvious, right? All of my students think of arguing almost by definition as being contention. That's simply what arguing is. Arguing is a version of the fight-flight paradigm. Somebody wins, somebody loses, somebody gives in, you fight back, you push harder. Why do they think that? Why do they think that the sword of contention is the kind of basic paradigm? Because they see it everywhere. Here's an example I really like because it comes from my local newspaper in Allentown, Pennsylvania. These are two columnists for the paper, Paul Carpenter and Bill White. I've read these guys for years. I used to love reading their columns. They're pretty sensible guys. I almost always agree with Bill White. I never agree with Paul Carpenter. But I like the guy. He's a really good writer. He's a smart guy. He takes on good issues. Well, a few years back, it's been a while now, the Morning Call newspaper decided that readers weren't interested enough in these editorials. And so they came up just out of the blue. I mean, I opened my paper one day and I looked, and I mean, my teeth fell out. Because all of a sudden, here was gentle Bill White and sweet Paul Carpenter in these cartoon poses. Because opinions on the opinion page needed to be understood as fights, as adversarial encounters. So these are two different ones. They're not arguing with one another. But you know, here's Paul Carpenter. You'll be sorry, fan. And here's Bill White. It's wrong. But I think the more you look around, the more you see these kinds of images associated with arguing. Arguing is a combat sport, at least as it's presented in the media. And so how can we blame students to think, well, that's just what arguing is. That's what we see. Here's a really great example, too. This is an ad that I took, I think, out of Newsweek or Time or something, for Crossfire. And this is old now. These people are all gone. In fact, the show's gone. But this is a great ad. And I always show this in class, and I ask the students to do a little analysis of it in this course. See, so what's going on here? What do you see? What's going on in this ad? Somebody see anything? What do you guys think?
Wrestling language.
It's actually not wrestling as much as it's boxing. But you're close.
WWF layout.
It sure is, isn't it? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's so right on target. The students tend to pick that up, although they don't always right away because there's that play, right? You know, it's like a commentator call. And there's a left, and a right, and another left, and another right. Debate is a boxing match, a wrestling match. It's a contest. It's contentious. And the language here, of course, left and right mean political positions, but look where this gets us. The left and the right are now locked in. WWF or whatever, what is it, WW, world, the wrestling, the boxing, okay, they're duking it out. What else here? Well, there's some other interesting things about this ad. Anybody see anything else? In terms of the symbolism or the
arm, everybody's arms are crossed as if they aren't going to listen to you.
Absolutely. Body language? Wow. And nobody's going to listen. Minds are made up, smug, self-protective. This is the perfect, illustration for the body language. Is I'm pissed off and I'm not listening to anybody else. Wow. So that's what a nationally televised debate program, that's what it is. And there's all kinds of other stuff here. Some of the language in the middle, the division with a wall between, And what about the name of the show? Oh, there's the big one, right? Crossfire. Combat, war, the most horrifying situation to be in combat. Caught in a crossfire, chewed up, destroyed. So in this ad, we've got now I'm going to show you another, I'm picking on Crossfire here. I'm going to show you another one. This is a video ad. And it goes by really fast and the quality is very poor. But, or pretty poor. But I think it's extremely interesting. Watch this ad. It goes by fast, but there are, I think, 4 images of conflict that are associated with arguing, which is what the program is all about. Watch for those images, okay? You're going to have to watch close.
Your job's by cutting defense
Just let me finish, John.
You wouldn't have passed anything this time if the president had put you on record.
We certainly would have.
For 3 years, you guys did nothing. Wait, if the Democrats' fault could have fooled me.
The top newsmakers go head-to-head with Michael Kinsley on the left and John Sununu on the right. Crossfire on CNN, where great minds come together.
You gotta be kidding me. So if students see this, if the meeting of great minds destroys locomotives at high speed, what is this game? Now, the most macho of them maybe are going to like this. Is it sumo wrestling? Is it a boxing match? Is it butting heads? I mean, I think it's kind of funny. I mean, we ought to, I think we can laugh at it. But underneath that chuckle, there's something I think really serious happening here. What's happening is that our culture has presented a paradigm for arguing to students coming to college that is highly adversarial and imbued with a lot of values that we don't think that much about, but I think have some deleterious effects when they get into rhetoric classes at the beginning. I think unwittingly, composition teachers can do some things that actually reinforce some of those adversarial tendencies without possibly meaning to. So let me talk about this model that the students have in their head. So one thing I've said about it is I think it's very adversarial. It's trains crashing together. Another thing about it, I'm going to see if I can get my slide to move forward here. That's what I have to do. There we go. I talked about this sword fighting being very linear. Now, you don't have to read any of the text on here. All I want you to see is the graphic. We're moving step by step through the points of argument. And that is exactly like the kata that I have them do for the sword fight. Okay, it begins, they raise the sword, and they begin to fight. Point 1, point 2, point 3, ha! Conclusion. Feels like that. And this is kind of the standard advice. Now, we may not give that in college, I hope, always, but this is what they come in with from high school. It's a very linear configuration. Here's another example from another site I found where argument is conveyed, portrayed, represented as a linear model. Here's a 5-paragraph paper on punishing criminals through hard labor. Again, I put the little sword figures next to it. They weren't in the original, obviously. To me, it looks very much like preparation, striking, and finally a kind of forward thrust in the conclusion. So I think these models very much capture this contentious atmosphere. And actually, let me just hold off on that one for a minute. So what I guess I want to say here is that we're trying to think about the ways in which students come to our classes with this particular model of arguing in their heads. Now, I'm not an extremist. I'm not going to say that that is an utterly inappropriate model in all cases, that all adversarial arguing is wrong or illegitimate. I think there really are some times and places for it. I think it has some powers that are important. But I also think that it's been widely overused. I'm going to get to that in a minute, talk about some more. But the other thing that this argument, these argument patterns have is it makes the whole enterprise of talking about argument really very contentious. Deborah Tannen wrote this book called The Argument Culture. Some people don't like it very much, but I think it has a lot of great points in it. And one of the things is she talks about this, all the things that I've been telling you about, the ways that culture has represented argument, produces this thing she calls an argument culture. And really, it's gotten to the point where everything we need to accomplish, we represent it as if it's a fight. It's getting in the way of solving our problems, she thinks. And finally, our spirits are sort of corroded by living in an atmosphere of unrelenting contention and argument culture. Maybe she's being a little bit extreme to make a point, but I think there's a lot to be said for it. As she says in another great quotation, one of my favorite quotations from the book, smashing heads does not open minds. I think a great counterpoint to the ad for Crossfire. Now, again, I just want to say that the culprit for me in all this is the impulse to draw that sort of contention without thinking about what the alternatives are. I want to try to foreground the alternatives. So I do take a kind of both-and approach. I think it's possible. I think there are legitimate uses for adversarial arguing, but I want to try to pay a lot of attention to the limitations and the things that get in the way of teaching students to argue well. I draw a lot on Peter Elbow, who's really one of my heroes, I think, in the field. I think one of the most creative thinkers. And Elbow talks about the doubting game and the believing game. And one of his shticks is that we're so caught up in the doubting game, we never even give credence to the believing game. But I like the way he phrases this. He says, let me emphasize, I'm not arguing against the doubting game. We need the ability to be skeptical and find flaws. My argument is against the monopoly of the doubting game as the only kind of good thinking. And I think this is pretty close to my philosophy of arguing. I'm not arguing against hard adversarial arguing. I'm against the monopoly, the idea that there's no other good way to argue, the way that students get trapped into thinking it's the only legitimate and effective way to argue back. And the reason I think that's such an unfortunate conception for them to have is that they are trapped then in really two responses in any kind of oppositional encounter: fight and flight. If I encounter someone in a confrontation physically, if I encounter a deep disagreement, I can either turn away from it and give in or refuse, or I can contest it. And sometimes you don't want to do either one. Either one of those is the best thing, the best result that can come out of that kind of confrontation. So in my spirit of broadening the repertoire, I want to show students there's some other things you could do. There are options other than fight and flight. So the whole impulse here for me is this impulse to draw the sword all too swiftly, the sword of contention. And I think that happens because students don't know what to do. Otherwise, that's what arguing is. So they need some education. I also think, though, that happens because contending is such a deeply, deeply ingrained response. Breaking it's going to be difficult, and it's not as easy as just learning a few new forms. Here's an excerpt from a student journal. I think she made this point really well. She was in my course on arguing differently, trying hard. It was difficult to switch gears from writing a one-sided, aggressive paper. When I first sat down to write the paper, it took me a very long time to consider the different options, which is what I'm asking them to do. In fact, my first attempt was very unsuccessful. My tone was becoming progressively more aggressive throughout the essay. At one point, I desperately wanted to take, I am right, and this is why approach, which shows how I tend to get aggressive when things don't turn out the way I would like them to. I kept thinking of how much easier the paper would be if I could just fight and forcefully coerce my ideas. Without even realizing, I had switched back to the mindset of writing an English paper the traditional way. This made me think of how often I resort to aggression when trying to prove a point, and how much the adversarial approach is ingrained in me. Well, this is remarkably honest and self-reflective. I think this could be said of many students. And what I really like especially about this is it shows, you might think, for example, okay, and I do cover the full range, right, from heated interpersonal interactions to written arguments. You might think, well, in writing, you got all the time in the world. Why wouldn't you just settle down and not be adversarial? You have time to think about it. But in a way, you're still trapped. In a way, writing's harder to step outside of because you're caught up in a form. There's no person there in front of you. Suddenly, old forms and paradigms and ways of arguing come to the fore without you really being aware of them and condition what you write. So breaking out of that, it's going to take something more. It's going to take learning new strategies and learning them well enough to use them. But it's going to take something else: awareness. awareness linked to mindfulness. And this is where mindfulness comes into play for me, at least one of the spots. And I'm gonna say a little more about that just in a bit. But the difficulty, and so the difficulty here of changing the way students argue means for me that I need to do more than take more than one kind of approach. And so my curriculum's built around these three sort of pedagogies or three approaches to teaching students about other ways to argue. I call them the conceptual, the visual, kinesthetic, and the contemplative. The conceptual is pretty much sort of standard kind of ideas about the nature of arguing. I mean, not just so standard because they're a little bit different in terms of the content, but the learning of them is students read articles about them, we discuss them in class, we do jump starts, we do practices, we do drafting, we do revising, we do peer feedback. All of these things play into a growing conceptual understanding of the patterns of arguing that are not the same ones that we've traditionally used. They need to learn those new ways and patterns, and I think that's really fundamental and important. We practiced some of those in the workshop this morning. I don't think any of you guys were here, but we went through like rewriting thesis sentences. That's a pretty standard activity I do because students need to learn a form of written expression at that key moment in a paper where you're moving from the introduction to the key arguments and ideas. That's not a thesis sentence. Because a thesis sentence is going to lead them right into exactly the kind of arguing that I do not want them to do if they're learning to argue differently. Now, let me say very, frankly here, I want them to know how to write a good thesis sentence, absolutely. And I teach that. But to argue differently, you've got to unlearn the thesis sentence. And that is not easy. That is not easy. I'm not going to go into that because I spent a lot of time on this morning. But I'm going to go to the visual kinesthetic. That's the one I want to spend the most time on right now. I use Aikido a lot as my model for how to understand visual kinesthetic patterns. This is a quote from a book where a guy writes about Aikido. I love just the way he expresses this. And he wants to talk about transforming habitual patterns of aggression. It's this idea of habitual patterns, these well-learned patterns, thesis sentence, and other things that students have to learn to break. And instead of having to choose, here we got the two choices only, running away or fighting, losing or winning, Aikido offered the warrior another choice. So I love Aikido for this reason, among many others, that I think the whole philosophy behind it is a third way, a different way, a new option for engaging in physical confrontation. And by analogy, I think, some new ways of engaging in rhetorical or verbal confrontation. And so I try to make use of those patterns as I'll be showing you soon. How's my time? Okay, I gotta hurry along here. We got till 4:30? Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit then about Aikido and Tai Chi and how I use them in my class. I'm going to move some of this through some of this a little bit quickly. I do start with the sword, as you know, but I kind of transition from the sword to what I call the open hand style. I think it's a little more effective because it's easy to feel it with your body. The swords, I think, are effective visually, the visual part. I think in terms of the kinesthetics, really the open hand practice, two-partner practices is actually more effective. So the first kinesthetic experience that I want my students to have is to stay in this linear configuration with an opposition partner. I'll be on this side. I'm receiving. So I'm still in a linear posture. But rather than do the thing that's associated with contention, which is, my view, your view, we're struggling. Whoever's stronger is going to push the other person over, or maybe linear confrontation, I want to teach them a different response. And that first different response, when feeling the pressure of opposition, is to actually be receptive, to yield, to go back. Now, this is very different from collapsing and getting hit. It's yielding energetically. It's staying in contact with the force, but not immediately pushing against it, but doing exactly the unexpected, which is when a push comes, to blend and receive it. So I get them to practice that a little bit, and that feels odd to them, but interesting, okay? So got their interest piqued here. The linear model that we usually think of is a very forceful one. I want to go there. If you want to experience this, you just push two hands against one another. I sometimes do this exercise, and I say, don't let the left hand beat the right. Oh, don't let the right beat the left. And soon you get like this, and I say, what are you doing? It's called an isometric exercise. Both arms getting stronger. And that's what opposition does. You think you're weakening your opponent, but actually you're getting stronger. At any rate, I want to move into this period of confrontation where something else happens. So we have a situation of confrontation, one pushing against the other. There is a kind of blending and receptivity. First thing I teach them is simply to blend back, but after that, to go through a different kind of movement where the blending turns into a kind of rotation, and there's a guiding of that force from my body to the side. Okay. Blending. Blending and receiving. And then at the end, pushing back toward the other. This is what it sort of looks like to people. Okay, and I get doing a little more with a turn of the foot. So they're practicing this. And this is all building up to another activity that's going to turn into Aikido eventually. Let me show you the more Aikido-like exercise. It begins the same way with a confrontation. The confrontation we're using here is a grab. I like grabs in the class because they're a kind of aggressive act, grabbing somebody, but it's not a punch, it's not a strike. If I have students starting punching at one another, I'm afraid what might happen. Somebody's going to have an accident and duke somebody out, and I'll end up in jail. So I simply have people grabbing one another. And after this grab, then, there's a shifting, a blending back. But now what we're doing to make it into more of an Aikido move is that this blending turns into a rotation and a stepping forward. And if you notice the other person going this way, I've moved into this position that I've called orthogonal. Orthogonality, or what I want to call arguing as redirection. And the move here has changed a confrontation that was face-to-face to one that is side-by-side. The arrow is pointed directly at one another to begin with. Now they're side-by-side, moving together. In terms of the rhetoric of this, I talk about the difference between a confrontational argument and a deliberative argument. Deliberation means to talk together about problems and solutions. So rather than debating, we're going to talk about things together. So this is what I've talked about before as this kind of sort of redirection. Things have been redirected. Now, how do you redirect an argument? I have 3 of these up here. I think there are a few more I could talk about, but I don't want to take a lot of time. One is to ask a catalytic question. A catalytic question can take an aggressive kind of two-sided argument and suddenly turn it and move it in another direction. Another writer I like talks about this as a better problem. A problem that doesn't lend itself to an either-or answer, but a problem that necessitates a broader view. Considering more than 2 options. Deborah Tannen's great on this. She said, you put 2 options on the table and it's going to be a struggle between them. Put 3 out there and everything changes. She talks about talk shows in Europe where they don't have 2 people debating, they've got 3. And the whole conversation changes. It's not a debate, it's a discussion. 3 is a discussion, 2 is a debate. What do we always have in America? 2. So I tell students, put another option out there and you're going to change the game. You're going to redirect things. Creative proposals can also do it. They're kind of a riskier move. The creative proposal, that kind of out-of-the-box one, that takes a takes an idea and just says, oh, heavens, did you ever think about this? The person goes, wow. I'll show you one of those wow ones in a minute, too. So here's some examples of these. Catalytic question, we can't read the whole thing. This was a paper about assisted suicide. It starts out by setting out the basic either-or argument that we always have, but I don't want to come down to the last part of it. Maybe there's no right answer. People should be asking why physician-assisted suicide is on the rise and why so many people wish to die. Perhaps the real question should be, what can we do to help people have the desire to live? I mean, this blows my mind. Like, I'm ready to say, I'm against this thing, and suddenly we're talking about how can we help people want to live? The whole issue's been redirected. We're talking about something else. Is it related? Yes, absolutely related. It's the same topic, but this catalytic question has converted it into a possibility where we can actually sort of have a discussion because it bypasses the stuck point of this head-to-head debate. I think these are difficult to do, but when this was a student-written one, when a student can pull it off, it's really great. Here's an example of the more than two options. This is a little bit boring, but this is about organ donations and what can we do. We always have these, we got to get into this debate about compensated organ donation. We should do it, we shouldn't do it. But look, whether we should do it or shouldn't do it is a really small part of the whole problem, this guy says, because there's a lot of things that we can do, a lot of interventions we can make that don't get us stuck in that. And there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and this whole payment, you come, wow, yeah, why don't we do this? Let's talk about this. Let's make this happen. It's still about organs, and compensation's still there in the background, but the whole debate isn't a debate pro and con. It's been reconstructed, it's been redirected. The last one I took, this was a professionally written one. I just loved it because it was so outrageous. How can we solve the gun control problem? Very simple. Let anyone own a gun. Doesn't matter what kind, so long as she's a woman. That's right. Guns for all women. No guns for men. Guns don't kill people. Dudes with guns kill people. So, it's outrageous. And actually, if a student wrote this, I'd probably give it a bad grade. I don't know. No, I'd love it. But it's kind of this wacky thing of saying, we can take this and turn it into this. What would happen to some gun freak guy who said, yeah, let everybody have guns, as long as she's a woman? I mean, you never heard that before. You don't know what to do with that. I mean, pro, con, what is it? It somehow finds a space that's different, that doesn't head back into that old, tired, well-worn, same old arguments you've always heard. Nobody's going to win. You're going to end up, the same boat you've always been in. So anyway, we're at this point where we're talking about redirection and how to get there. So the movement sequence that I've shown you provides what I think of as a kind of way. It's one of these modes of trying to understand what this kind of arguing might be, because this is a different sort of arguing. So by understanding it through this body movement, that it's taking a force and redirecting it and your opponent comes with you in another direction. I think for a lot of students that sort of clicks. Oh, I see how that might work. Maybe don't know quite how to do that in writing yet, but I have a model of what it would mean. Not a model in language, but a model coded in bodily response and visual imagery. I think that's very important. I think it's one piece. It's not the only one. I think they need the conceptual too. But I think this is an overlooked and very powerful way of learning. But I still think there's something else that they need if they're going to resist this very, very strong impulse to argue back. How do you resist confrontation and engage redirection? You need what I'm calling, just a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a superpower. And I mean, in a way you do. This is not easy. When somebody comes at you with an argument, the propensity to argue back and be adversarial is so strong, so deeply ingrained, so culturally enforced, that to do something else in that moment, asks for a lot. Let me tell you what this superpower is. I've got a video to show you.
You may have heard this word mindfulness. It's become something of a buzz phrase of late. I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us, we normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. With just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation.
So I think that's a pretty compelling little video. I show that to my students, and it's, the more I see it, the richer I think it is. We've got exactly that situation that I'm talking about in a confrontation, where the anger, the self-righteous thoughts, the propensity to respond in a certain way comes up, and once it gets activated, it's very, very difficult to control or turn off until it runs its course. And then you look back and say, gee, I wish I hadn't smashed that guy with a beer bottle or whatever. Too late. So the only hope of enacting a different framework or arguing in another way is to catch the impulse to argue violently or whatever you're going to do early enough that you can activate a different behavioral response. And as this suggests, in this version it says, with a little bit of mindfulness, you can notice things like the bodily signals that something's about to happen. You notice them. Why? Because you've been trained to pay attention. You pay attention to things. You see a reaction forming before you act on it because you've been trained to watch things arising in your mind. That's what mindfulness is. And you can make some choices. Now, it might not be that simple, but I think we can get students started on this. Here's some other people who talk about this. Oops, what happened here? It seems like I don't have my right slide here, but I'm going to bypass it anyway. Oh, you know what? I think I decided I would hold off. There's another version of this. I'll come back to this point, okay? So let me I think I wanted to move on and talk about this third sword real quickly. Sorry, the sword of transformation. And I'll get back to the mindfulness piece in a minute because I think it applies even better to this. Here, what happens is the confrontation is transformed immediately into the side-by-side configuration. This is the initial step in an extended move. I'll just go through this quickly. Begin in confrontation, move around the point of contact, stand beside the other person. There's the first moves of transformation. And this whole action here builds out of the other moves we saw and is linked to attentive listening. Here's what a student said about listening. When I thought I was listening to the other side, I actually wasn't. I was not being mindful to what the opposition side was saying because I simply did not care. I'd always gotten into the habit of thinking, what is the point of really listening when I know what I believe in? This is where mindfulness comes into play for me. So again, it's this idea of confronting an opposition, and in this move now, turning all the way around and standing right beside them. They don't even have to move. This way. Confrontation, I'm just going to move around it. I'm not going to engage it. And I'm going to end up at a point where I'm side by side looking in the same direction. And that's called listening. I'm going to listen to what the other side says. But this attentive listening, too, is not always easy. Mindfulness is what helps with attentive listening. It involves something like what this author talks about, widening the gap between action and reaction, getting distance from automatic responses, and getting an opportunity to know your emotions. This was an article in Tricycle just last month, last winter issue, I think, where this author is talking about the capacity of mindfulness to widen this gap between action and reaction. Well, the most famous person that talks about this is Paul Ekman. He's a well-known psychologist. He's done a lot of studies of this. And here's what he says. He says it takes time for the impulse to get translated into action. You want to lengthen that time so you can spot the impulse arising before you act. This is not easy. The only thing that seems to stretch that out is a contemplative practice called mindfulness. Wow. Now, this sounds like good news for mindfulness. Actually, in Ekman's version, he thinks it takes a whole lot of mindfulness, probably a whole lot more than students are going to get in a class. But I still feel strongly that meditation and mindfulness is worth working on in a class. So I try to build it in. I build in especially this kind of extended meditation. The way I do it in my course is that I meet we meet 3 days a week for about an hour in my regularly scheduled class, and then I schedule an additional hour for my students, and that's called a lab. I have it registered, the registrar calls it a lab section, just like there's a lab section for bio, right? You have your bio and you have your bio lab. Well, for this, you have your seminar and your seminar lab. In the lab, which is kind of a nice space, I work on both these body movements, so we do the Aikido and Tai Chi exercises kind of repeatedly to get a sense of those. We also do meditation and mindfulness exercises, including periods of sitting meditation for beginning with 3 minutes and ending with about 15 by the end of the semester. Students build up to it, they talk about it, they discuss their issues with it. This activity really clicks for some students. They continue to do it outside the class. And it's great when it clicks. But in addition to extended meditation, I really put a strong emphasis on brief centering practice. And here's it's too long a quote, but I think it's really important. It comes from a book about meditation I really love. It has a terrible title, Real Meditation in Minutes a Day. It doesn't sound like a book you want to buy in the airport and throw away, but it's actually a great book. It's just got a terrible title. Anyway, these guys say extended practice sessions, which they've just been talking about, last at least 15 minutes. By practicing extended technique, you will improve its centering, your mind will become steadier. But if you practice only the extended technique, you will inadvertently teach your mind 2 things. First, your mind will get accustomed to always having 15 or more minutes to get centered. It will not learn to center quickly. Second, you will teach your mind that centering is something that you do in the setting where you practice meditation. The solution is to practice a brief centering technique several times throughout the day. These brief sessions should last no more than a minute. I remember when I first read this, I thought this was absolutely brilliant. Well, absolutely important for me in terms of what I'm trying to do with arguing. Because let's face it, when somebody's coming at you with a sword and when you're getting involved in a confrontation, you can't say, oh, hang on, let me get centered. Where's my cushion? Give me 10 minutes. You got to do it now. Quick, fast. And I think it's exactly what he's saying. Well, I think, and these authors say the same thing. The extended are basic. You've got to learn to watch your mind and to engage in this kind of mindful breathing over periods of time. But that can't be all you do, because you've got to be able to activate this centered, mindful response in a very short period of time when a situation develops. Now think how related this is to the martial arts, right? In martial arts training, what you're taught to do is to forget everything as soon as a fight starts. Somebody comes at you, you can't start thinking, oh, I better get my moves ready, because you're dead. You just are fully present, wide awake, and ready to respond from a place that's not intellectual. You just respond. There's centeredness. And one of the reasons that the samurai, even though they were mostly bloodthirsty killers, but the spiritual ones of them were very drawn to Zen and meditation because it gave them a technique for finding their center and being grounded and letting go of all their thoughts and techniques in moments of crisis and confrontation. So I'm trying to see analogies again between these kind of situations, extreme ones, and argument situations, which I also think are oppositional encounters. They are oppositional confrontations. And so they have some of the martial qualities that I've been trying to pull in through things like the sword and Aikido. I think I'm going to have to move a little more quickly here. Probably going to run out of time. What I just try to do with mindfulness then is say I'd like students to be able to be mindful that a conflict is occurring. We're going to disagree about this. A fight is starting. Attention to reactions. I'm feeling angry about what she's saying. You know, that's the starburst. I'm getting blushed. Awareness. Ability to remain calm, composed, and non-reactive. Especially just this kind of mantra. Breathe deeply and just listen. Breathe deeply and just listen. And access to options. What's my best response in this situation? Now, all of that has to take place very rapidly, especially when you're in a physical. When you're writing, it can be there's more time to do it, but paradoxically, you can be more trapped in an old paradigm and not think to do it. So, listening, activating the listening impulse, receiving, paying attention, not being hostile, and having this mindfulness capacity, I think, is really vital for arguing. So the sort of transformation then is this move that is really quite transformative. I love this quotation too, where a writer, this is actually a religious studies writer, talks about how in the moment of the attack, when they're face to face, people only see their own view. I mean, the enemy's there in a way, but it's your view that you want to compel them. And this is right, this is right, this is right. Whereas when you turn around, here's the enemy standing here, your opponent, and you turn around, you say, hey, I see what you see now. Okay? A literal and symbolic turning away from confrontation with the other in order to experience what the other sees. Or as I want to say, hear what the other is saying. This is attentive listening. So I want to try to build attentive listening into the paradigm. Listening attentively. So the first move in this Aikido sequence that I'm showing students is confrontation, turning 180 degrees, and simply listen attentively. Then there's some more moves here, because there are two other 180-degree turns in the whole sequence that I'm working on. Confrontation, right? Turning alongside. And then there's going to be a leading around, because now I'm looking parallel with my opponent at what they think. I'm listening attentively. At the end of listening attentively, I would like them to listen to me. I've heard you out. I see what you say. I see some wisdom in it. But I see things a little differently. Let me tell you how I see this situation. They are here, right here beside you as you turn around. And now you're looking at your view, but together. Not arranged oppositionally, confrontationally, but arranged in a cooperative, parallel way. Looking together as you articulate your view. And the last move in this particular sequence, and there are a couple of variations on this, but one of them is to simply come back around again and face one another. But facing one another now, not in agreement, because no one's been persuaded. Where they are is they understand each other more deeply and empathetically. They disagree, but they don't hate one another. They don't think each other's an idiot. So I'll just show you a little bit here. They face in the opposite direction, move back to face differences again with better understanding. And you can see what's interesting about this Aikido move. When they began at the beginning, the against and for, the left-right orientation was there. After they go through this little dance, they're in the opposite positions at the end. And the symbolism here is against is standing in the shoes of for, and for is standing where against stood. And so while they still see things differently, they've stood in the other's place, and they've listened, and they've got a deeper understanding. Is this worth anything? I think, again, I'm going back to Peter Elbow's believing game, which I think is very parallel. Peter Elbow says, the believing game will help us understand ideas we disagree with. It can help us see that both sides in an argument are often right, or that both sides are right in a sense, or that both positions are implicitly pointing to some larger, wiser position that both arguers can agree on. There are a lot of options here. Perhaps there can be some agreements on some things, but a kind of mutual understanding. So that listening, even when there's not agreement, can be a positive and very productive exercise. So I'm going to just end things out here, maybe quickly. I apply this in what I call a sequence related to Rogerian rhetoric. Rogerian rhetoric developed in the late 60s and early 70s as an alternative kind of argument style designed to bridge very deep chasms of difference. In this sequence, you acknowledge, disclose, turn again, and conclude. There's some important pieces to this. The first step is simply to acknowledge we disagree about something. This one is about the death penalty. The student writing it now, this is how it translates into writing. The writer, because you don't have two people now, the writer imagines the opponent and says, hey, this is something that people disagree a lot about. I tend to support the death sentence as a valid form of punishment. But I respect the caution those who oppose it take in regards to ending a human life. It is certainly not something to take lightly, and I feel their concerns are reasonable and deserving of further consideration. So here's what happens. At the beginning, there's this big argument. Now, I have this view. That comes first in the subordinate clause. But I think there's a case to be made for the other side, and that's the side the other person is on. So now we're standing and doing the attentive listening. And attentive listening in a piece of writing is really a summary of the views of the other side. And then there's a kind of summing up in this other turn. Those who oppose the death penalty hold many valid concerns about its use. Remember, this is the view the author does not support. Those who oppose it hold valid concerns. Yes, it's morally questionable, can be deficient, consumed by small number. Yes, its usefulness as a deterrent is disputed. This is a summary of the views that she has unpacked as part of understanding and showing, I've listened to this argument, and this is my best sense of what it says. However, it is my belief that there are some circumstances in which the only route to justice is through execution. Now they've turned to the writer's view, and what the writer's going to do is to explain why she thinks there are circumstances that justify execution. She's not arguing. She's not saying you're wrong. She's saying, let me tell you why this is what I think. This is what leads me here. And the idea is that if a person who doesn't think this has felt listened to, well, the person heard me out on why I'm opposed to it, be much more likely, in fact, I think, feeling compelled to listen to the other person's view. Conclude by affirming the opposing view. The taking of life is a serious matter. I understand why people have reservations about allowing a jury to decide whether or not another human being should be put to death. I respect the care with which they approach the topic and find many of their opinions reasonable. Now, this is a very different tone and ethos from the attacking adversarial position. I respect that there are objections. However, I feel that situations arrive where it would be morally wrong to fail to execute the perpetrator of a heinous crime. Justice for certain crimes such as brutal murders, rapes, etc., would be extremely difficult to achieve with any sentence other than death. Now, I think this is interesting because there is a kind of, this is not a wishy-washy ending, is it? Is this wishy-washy? No. You know exactly where she stands. But neither is it presented as a claim that is an assault on the, you don't have to believe this, you don't have to agree with me. But I want to tell you, I can see why you have reservations and concerns. I think they make sense. I think I've really listened to them. Here's why it seems to me to be viable, and I stand here. Here's where I stand. So they're opposed, but in a very different spirit, I think, than the one in most adversarial argument. So this is how, and getting to write this kind of a paper is extremely hard for students. I think it's facilitated when they've done the Aikido movement. The students seem to think works for them. Times when they got confused, thinking of the sword movements helped me realize certain things. I think the Aikido move we did was useful, gave a real life demonstration when pressure was needed, when you needed to be more gentle. And then I really like this one. As I was trying to write the introduction, I turned what we've done with Aikido tactics. I never thought that reflecting on these techniques would help me get a move on my paper. The physical aspect of the turning and facing different directions really helped illustrate the purposes and effectiveness of the strategy. Usually I'd focus on persuading my opposition. However, from the Aikido tactics, I physically saw how the opposing parties can reach a mutual understanding that makes the solution process a lot easier. Now, students also talk about the meditation component of the class. They're pretty enthusiastic about the Aikido moves and the way that they help them conceptualize arguing. What do they say about the mindfulness? Well, to be honest, they're a little more reserved about its benefits for arguing, although they're incredibly enthusiastic about the practice. When I ask them, what's the one thing you're going to take away from this course, what I always want them to say is, boy, we learned to argue differently, and that was really cool. A few say that, but almost all of them say, mindfulness has become one of the most meaningful things in my life that I've done. And I don't even want it to be that. That's not the answer I want. That's not why I do it. I do it because I really feel that it has a functional relationship to arguing. But they find things about it helping them be calm and collected and purely widely awake, which I think is really great. So let me just give a quick wrap up and say that what I'm trying to do here is expand the scope of arguing, showing students different models. I'm trying to use different sort of pedagogies to do this. I like to see these continuities for students between the everyday arguments they have and the more formal arguments they're writing. This, again, is one of the most gratifying parts of teaching this class. I have them keep a journal, do weekly entries in it. And the stories they tell about situations of conflict in their daily lives are very moving. And some that are long-standing, very, very acrimonious relationships, especially with parents or with siblings, people they care about but can't get along with. And then the stories they tell about having tried these techniques, even though they were somewhat skeptical about them, and seeing how it changed a relationship that really mattered with them. I'll just tell you one really quick anecdote, one of my favorites. Student who had a lot of money issues with her mom. I don't think the student was very responsible because I'm now the parent, right, looking at this. But anyway, she calls her mom, very apprehensive because they can't talk about money, and she's going to have to ask her for a money thing. And so she's on the phone, how are you? Yeah, and she asks about the money thing, and her mom just blows up, starts screaming in the phone, you are the most irresponsible. And she said, normally, this is what she wrote in her journal, normally, I would have shouted back at her, I'm not responding, you're just so stingy. She said, that was our pattern. This is what we did all the time. Because now, if you remember, they're from New York, too. This is what people do in New York. They scream at each other all the time. She said, instead, I remembered what we said in class. I took a deep breath, and I just listened. And I let her talk. She talked, started getting milder. Anger went out of her voice. She sort of exhausted herself. And when there was a little bit of a pause, the student said, Mom, you're right. You're right. I see what you're saying. I see where you're coming from. I admit that I have done some pretty irresponsible things. And I'm sorry. But I have to let you know, I'm trying to be different. I'm trying to change. And I want you to know this situation I brought up right now is a little different. And I'd like you to hear me out. You know what the mom said? What's wrong with you? Are you on drugs? I'm going to drive down there right now and see what's the matter with you. People don't talk like that to one another. She said, no, Mom, honestly. Well, what do you... And she said, we had the best conversation we'd ever had. Because I listened to her, And she was willing to listen to me. She, at the end, she put more money in my credit card balance, and she got what she wanted. But she got what she wanted in a way that, that healed a wounded relationship. So I think these patterns and trying to make this, so I think if this can come out of a rhetoric class, this is a really great thing. But I also want, of course, the payoff in writing papers differently. Anyway, I got to move to the close here. I would just encourage anybody to kind of think about a couple of things I've said, broadening the scope. I think the idea of the body movement using visual kinesthetic, I think that's a really powerful thing. I'm not going to tell you I have the last word on that. I'm just playing around with a few things. I don't think it needs to be Aikido. I don't think it even needs to be the martial arts. I think these movements I've done you could do without any martial arts training. I think you'd use other physical activities. Basketball is one I know somebody's worked a lot with, who uses basketball moves and strategies in the bounded court and makes analogies to argument situations. So, but I think students really, really appreciate that. The students who appreciate this an awful lot are student athletes. Often feel that their knowledge, their skills with their bodies are unappreciated and untapped in normal college classrooms. I get great responses from them. My women basketball players who come up and say, I feel like I understand what you're talking about, and I never have understood this stuff before. Because I don't think, in my head all the time. I move my body on the court, and this is making real sense to me. So I think it's appealing, again, to another kind of audience and broaden these things out, and I don't think it's that hard to do. I would say the mindfulness practices, too, are really worth working with, that they're great benefits. To me, again, it's not the generalized benefits of mindfulness, as much as I believe in them and love them, but it's the superpower possibility. This is an idea I've just begun playing with, but the fact that mindfulness could be the superpower that enables students to change the way they respond when arguing, that unlocks the key to attentive listening. I think this is something I really want to pay some more on. So I think this combination of approaches that I said too is very powerful, not trying to do this all one way. Of course, as academics, we always want to do it conceptually, give them a bunch of principles or practices. I think having the three modes working together is really powerful. And I guess after about a decade of teaching this class in various versions, I'm more committed than ever to the idea that pedagogy ought to engage the head, the hand, and the heart. And that's what's going to make it really viable. Now, thank you very much. Appreciate your attention. I ran probably way over time here.
So if you have any questions, maybe we'll spend a couple of minutes just in case folks have some questions, and I'll give you the mic if you want to ask us, because we're recording those for folks who want to take advantage of that. Does anybody have questions for Barry?
I have a lot I could say, but I got to go back to my office before the library locks. But then I get to talk to you later too.
Oh, okay, that's cool. That's cool. Well, somebody this morning asked a great question, I thought.
Yes.
It was about disabilities.
Yes, yeah.
And I just thought that was really spot on and a legitimate question, a tough one. You said, look, I have a lot of students in my class with various kinds of limitations and disabilities and so forth. How could this pedagogy work with them? And have you worked with those kinds of students before? And I had to admit, I have not done a lot of it. But I'm actually kind of optimistic that the kinesthetic pedagogy even seems as if you'd need to be normally abled or whatever, can work very well with students who have some kinds of limitations. Movement limitations, for example. There are versions of Aikido that are practiced just standing still or sitting in a chair. I'm telling this group this morning, I've graduated to what's called the old man class in my Aikido group. And we're so fragile, we can't do a lot of the stuff we used to do when we were young. So my sensei, very great guy and very responsive to this, has taken a group of us some of them are very physically, one guy just had a heart attack, another guy had a knee replaced, this guy with a bad back can't do things. So he's teaching us in a class where we sit in chairs and we do Aikido. Can't move anymore, we're old. But we can do those techniques and they're incredibly forceful from a chair. I was blown away. He talks a lot, for example, about maybe you'd have to do this on an airplane and you're strapped in. What are you going to do? I mean, there are real applications here. I think people who have sight impairment could do a lot of these very easily because they are very kinesthetic and they're touch related. There's a touching element to the Aikido and the feeling of the body moving around. That felt sensation, I think, might be particularly appropriate. One of the books I read when I was doing some of this work was about kinesthetic learning, And one person was actually talking about how kinesthetic learning for the blind is a very powerful mode of learning. So I'm not sure I'm sure there would be challenges, but I think that it doesn't mean, you don't have to have a class of all perfectly healthy 18-year-old athletes to do this kind of kinesthetic work. Anyway, I don't know. Anybody got a question about anything at all? Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the idea of the three sword forms, and it occurs to me that you could make the case that each one of them could be used as a metaphor for harmful argument.
That's true.
That instead of a progression, I think about what's happening in politics right now and how deflection and noise and craziness becomes a way of not talking about the issue, right?
Yeah.
Not being able to do that. Certainly 6 a.m. tweets are an example of a deflection from what the core issue is. And then also the idea of going forward together. Well, when two opposing parties don't listen to each other at all, they're just one party moving forward and repeating themselves as well. So I think I will ponder this idea of the three sword forms and what then is the counterbalance from each of them as harmful argument. And I wonder does that ever come up in your classes or as a way of helping them understand rhetoric?
I mean, I've certainly thought a lot about that myself. I totally agree with you. I think we are in a climate rhetorically right now where it's difficult to see what the best strategy is, because I think you're right. I think the redirection can be a form of avoidance. I don't think it needs to be that, but it could be. I think there's room for the sword of confrontation, even if it is a harmful and aggressive mode. There are things out there that need to be opposed, ideas that are bad. The question then becomes, who decides what needs to be opposed and what doesn't? If everything needs to be opposed, then we're just in warfare, you know? So I think what I try to tell students is this. Here's my bottom line, and it comes when I say, what I've offered you is a set of different options or paradigms for arguing. That comes at a price. The price is you have to choose one. How do you choose? How do you know in a given situation which to do? If sometimes it's okay to argue hard, how do you know that it's not okay this time? Why wouldn't you? And that's the toughest question of all. That comes right at the end. What I say is you probably need to have a style of arguing that becomes a kind of presumption for you, the presumptive response. And to me, the presumptive response in our culture has been the adversarial one. I would like to urge them to consider that the presumptive response should be non-adversarial. But it's presumptive. A presumption means that I presume that this could work. But if it doesn't, I'm prepared to do something else. So that, for example, I talk sometimes about when we redirect and begin to lead forward, this can go right back into a fight. All the person has to do is turn out and say, hey, I'm not going there. And there you are. I would probably yet do another thing and try a different strategy in that direction, because I think at that point you could go, hey, let's blend around with this thing. But at some point it may just come to a fight. That's why I think that I don't want to be dogmatic and say there's never room for fighting. I think we fight too much. I think we're an overly adversarial culture. That doesn't mean there aren't times and places for it, and it's not a viable technique. To me, again, it's the patterns. I think it's very hard. What you've raised is the hardest question of all. What are the advantages and limitations of all of them? How can they be worked together? And if you know several, how in the world did you decide in the moment which one you want to use? And that's where really what you need, and this is what college students are not going to have right away, is what I would call phronesis. You know, the ability to make a wise judgment about what the best set of actions are in a given set of circumstances. And so I think it's by practicing a lot and honing your skills at making those decisions, they become able to decide, I see an opportunity in this moment to do this here. To me, that's very much like the martial arts. I mean, at the higher level of the martial arts, where I am not yet, okay, I'm not going to pretend that I'm like real skilled at this stuff. But I see the people who are really good. When they're really good, when a situation develops and there's some sort of attack of some type, we practice all the time, they simply see an opportunity in that attack to do something interesting with it. They see, I go here. I look at it and I say, how did you know to do that? Did you think you were going to do that? No, I didn't think I was going to do that. In that moment, I saw that opportunity. I think there's something about that in argument too. That in the moment of argument, you see, is there an opportunity here to redirect, to transform, or is this a situation where I simply have to stand my ground and hold out against this thing? Anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and for your patience and everything. So this video will be up, so I'll let everyone know when it does. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks.